of innovators the innovators have participated in our Flipping Finance Challenge. We may have some communities jump on here who had challenges for these innovators to solve. They'll have sponsors on as well, and the bond bank team. And so we are so thrilled to have you, Brenda and Dennis, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Just by way of background, my name is Dennis Auden. I'm head of the Public Finance Department here at Bose McKinney and Evans. I've been doing public finance for a little over 20 years. And to give you a little flashback on the time machine, Mark wasn't totally honest on what he said. I remember when Mark was a junior associate here at Bose McKinney and Evans way back in the day, and Mark and I would work on projects. And he's gone on to greater things, and now it's great we get to work with him at the bond bank. But Mark, if you ever want to come back and fill out a timesheet, we're here for you.
My name's Brenda DeVries, and I'm a partner here in our public finance group, and I've been doing bond work for just over 10 years. And happy to be working with Dennis and Jacob McClellan, another partner here in our group over here at Bose.
Yeah, Brenda and I have some notes here on what we want to kind of talk about. And like Mark described, we're going to do kind of a high level discussion about what is a bond, how does the bond issuance process work, and kind of the roles that we play and maybe others play in kind of the bond financing process. But before we get started, we did want to open it up and say, if we want this to be interactive, if we can. So if any of the audience members have questions or comments or want to participate, we'd certainly enjoy hearing that. So as we get started, let us know if you've got questions or comments, and we can just do a free flow discussion if that works. So I'll get started here. Britt and I were kind of talking about, what do we think about a bond? And from the highest level, it's really a means for borrowing money. So if you think about the basic level, it's kind of like, well, if I go buy a car, or if I go buy a house, most of those instances, you are going to be borrowing money, and you'll be signing a promissory note and a loan agreement with a bank, and they're going to look at your credit history. Well, governmental entities, it's kind of the same thing on a much, much higher level. There's millions of dollars involved, but at the end of the day, they're signing a bond, which is like a note on a car, and they're signing a series of agreements, which can be what we call a trust indenture or a bond ordinance. It has a bunch of covenants and promises out there, and it's the means to actually borrow money. And Brenda and I are up here. We're on the 31st floor of the Salesforce Tower in Indianapolis, and we're looking south. And Brenda, what do we see out here? Lucas Oil Stadium. I see the field house, roads, Circle Center Mall, the hotels. And if we were looking north, what will we see?
The library.
IPS school buildings. And if we look out to the west, we're going to see the airport. All of those projects have been bond financed. And we think about when you wake up in the morning, you turn your faucet on, you flush your toilet, you get in your car and you drive. Parking
billings, yeah.
Dropping your kids off at school. These are all projects that have been bond financed. So it touches our lives every day. Brittany, we talk about a bond. What's like a difference between that and like if I borrowed money from a bank? Is it just as a debt instrument?
So a bond is basically, in its simplest form, a debt or a loan incurred by a governmental entity. And it's basically a bond would be issued and sold to a private investor or a bank. I don't exactly know what you're trying to get at with your question.
Well, I was thinking like it's a negotiable instrument. Okay. It's kind of neat if you hold a bond. It's kind of like if I have a share of stock as an investor. When we work on these deals, for example, and we've worked on a bunch of them with Mark and the bond bank, and they do some really big high profile deals. We'll have underwriting firms that go out and they'll sell $100 million of bonds. And so those investors, when they buy that bond, they're kind of helping with the loan, but they can take that bond, can't they? And they can resell it.
That's true. Yep.
Which is a little different than like your mortgage. When you borrow from a bank, that mortgage kind of stays with that bank and you interact with them. But these bonds are freely tradable in the marketplace. They have a value to them. Depending on what's going on with the interest rates in the marketplace and the credit history of the issuer, they can have different values. I think that was kind of
Yeah,
what I was thinking on that.
So that's basically what a bond is. Does anybody have any questions about understanding, like at its simplest form, what a bond is? Because we thought another topic that would be helpful would be getting into the process for issuing bonds and how a governmental entity goes about that process. So we can talk about that. Typically, the way it would start is there would be a need for a project, either like a water, if they need a new water plant or upgrades to their sewer system, or a new school building, or even like a golf course. We finance golf courses or fire trucks, or any sort of need for infrastructure or some sort of public project. So they would go through that, determine what the need is first, and then they would start to assemble their team in order to get that project or those bonds issued. So there's several members that would work together on this team, starting with like the elected officials or the school board members if it's going to be a school project. So a lot of times we'll work with the mayor or the clerk treasurer, the council president, any elected official at the local level, as they're determining what the need is for that project. And we'll get brought in along with the engineer, if it's an infrastructure project like water or sewer improvements, or an architect, if it's going to be a building that needs to be built like a rec center. We financed those before. There might also be a local project manager that's brought on to help manage the project, along with a municipal advisor to help them work through the total costs and what can the municipality or the school actually afford based on the revenue streams and the interest rate environment and the project costs just in general, which the engineers or architect will help provide those. And right now we've seen in a lot of the projects that we're working on, that's been an interesting part of the process where we've gone through several steps and then all of a sudden bids will come back after the project is put out to bid, and the cost with the environment right now, the bids come way over. So then we have to go back to the authorizing body or the local unit of government or the school board or whatever it is, and figure out, do they want to increase the authorization for the total cost of the project, or do they want to cut out part of the project in order to bring those costs back down into what the amount is that they've authorized for the borrowing. So the municipal advisor plays a really important role on the working group team as they work with the officials, the authorizing body, the local level who will be issuing the debt, and the engineers and the working group members who are helping to plan the project. So that's the municipal advisor as part of the team. And then we serve as bond counsel. So a lot of times they'll bring us in, and our role is to help organize the working group and also plan like the timing and make sure that all of the statutorily required steps for this bond issuance are achieved. So we'll put together a schedule, we'll plan in the various meetings that are required for the adoption of resolutions or ordinances. We'll work with the town to submit notices to the paper for any public hearings that will be required, or notices of objection periods that need to run that are required by statute, which would give the public time to object to the project if they had any objections to like the issuance of that debt. So we also help with the timing of like establishing the closing date and taking in lots of considerations. We were talking that there's other considerations too when we're working on the schedule, even like if it's an election year.
Yeah, the politics. Yeah, it's interesting. And I kind of what you were saying, Brenda, and we've been dealing with this. You all have probably seen kind of inflation. It's affecting all of us, whether we go to the grocery store, certainly see it at the gas pump. We know prices are going up, and it's going across the board. And we have these projects, and this approval process sometimes can take 3 to 4 months. And like Brenda said, it involves legal notices and hearings. And sometimes we even have to go to state agencies to get approval. For example, with utilities, there's an Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission where we'll go and we'll say, hey, we have a project, it's $3 million. We need borrowing authority for $3 million. And we've been over there for 4 months getting this approval. And we're going off engineers' estimates, which historically have always been very sound, and they build in room for contingency. We're having this unprecedented inflation now, and the bids are coming in, and that 4 million project, it's $5.5 million. And that's the low bid. And guess what? That bid is only good for 60 days. And we want to hold it because we expect prices going up. Now we're kicking ourselves back and we're like, all right, we got to go back to the commission, get more borrowing authority. And are we going to be able to increase the rates? Does the borrower, the community, still want to do the project? It probably needs to, most of these projects need to be done. And sometimes there can be like an IDEM order or some regulatory reason that the project has to get done. And so these are interesting times for us, for sure. And on top of that, we have a rising interest rate environment as well. So it's kind of piling onto the cost. But you can see these external factors that we don't have control of have a rippling effect off everything we do. And we're going back and recalibrating timetables. And Brenda and I were kind of talking about, the difference between a bond and maybe borrowing, for a car loan or for a purchase of a home or even a company borrowing. What's the big difference? What are we really talking about here? As bond counsel, what we're really doing is making sure that when those bonds are issued, we're giving an opinion that they've been validly issued by the governmental entity, and that if they're tax exempt for federal tax law purposes, which most of them are, that the holders of those bonds will be able to claim exemption from interest. But from a standpoint of borrowing by a governmental entity, these are public funds. They're subject to the public trust. And because of that, there are statutory procedures that are in play to ensure that there's an opportunity for public comment on the project, and there's an opportunity to object in many cases on the project. Not always, but on almost every project, there's going to be an opportunity for a public hearing. And these are incorporated into statutes. And there's also statutory limitations on how much you can borrow, how long you can borrow, what the payment source is, what's the maximum interest rate. These controls are all put in place by our good legislature to ensure that, the public funds are being applied to public projects and they're being properly applied. So you'll sometimes hear people say, government red tape, but it's important. It's important. This is what the red tape is for. It's to protect the public, ensure that the funds are being properly spent. And that's a big part of what we're doing. And so oftentimes it's kind of neat, I think, being an attorney like us. We were talking with Mark and Marissa before we hopped on here about our travels yesterday. And I was in Southern Indiana with several clients at board meetings. And Brenda, you were up Northwest, weren't you?
I was in Northern Indiana last night for a meeting, and it was the final step in an approval process for essentially like a residential subdivision that this community is planning. And it's a newer use of the residential TIF statute, which has just been in place for a year or two now. So it's been interesting for us to see the communities and developers work within these law changes and to establish some economic development opportunities for communities around the state. So I was up north, you were south, and so I guess that's our role as bond counsel. And we'll kind of go through a few more members of the working group team that the community or the school board or the issuers, what we call them, will put together.
Yeah, and one thing too on that, when we talk about the issuer or the governmental entity, people would say, if I'm not familiar with it, I go, oh yeah, my town went out and did a bond issue to build a new fire station. But what do we mean by the town? Really who it is, the decision makers are, that's the town council. It's typically a 5-member board. They have a town council president. They're elected every 4 years. In a city, it's a mayor, but the mayor also has a council that they work with. And if it's a county, that's your county council and your board of commissioners. And if it's a school, it's your board of school trustees, and so on and so on. But these are all elected officials making these decisions. But of course, running through the process of holding the public hearings and getting the public input. But at the end of the day, when we say the city, town, or school, who are we really working with? It's these elected officials that are kind of running the show.
about the project and approving the project as they work together with the engineer and bond counsel and the financial advisor. So there may also be, as part of this working group, like a trustee that's chosen by the issuer, the local unit of government, so to serve as trustee for these bonds. And a lot of times they'll hold these accounts so that one of the bond issues I'm working on currently, they're going to have a trustee, and the developer will submit essentially requisition requests and ask that the trustee release those funds as part of this bond issue back to the developer to reimburse the developer for their investment in this residential subdivision project.
Yeah.
So the trustee essentially oversees the accounts and makes sure that the funds are being released at the appropriate time and that the debt service payments are being paid.
I get the question asked quite often when I'm at meetings. People are concerned because we're talking about large sums of money here. And I'll tell you, I've worked on bond issues. The smallest one I've worked on, I think, was $110,000. And the largest one I've worked on was like $550 million. So they range all over the place. But oftentimes we'll be in meetings and a concerned member of the public may say, well, how do I know when this $20 million gets issued that those funds are really going to be spent on this project? How can I trust the board members when they're telling me that that's what's going to take place? Or Dennis, you're telling me that this is going to happen. How can I be sure that's going to take place? And like Brenda said, that's what the trustee does. We have, this is a bond transcript financing book. Mark's smiling. I can see he's seeing these. And this is actually the trust indenture right here. It's you probably can't see it very well, but
70 or 80 pages.
yeah, but it's usually about an 80 to 100 page document. That document is with the trustee and the issuer. So let's say it was, City of Indianapolis. That would be with Indianapolis and the trustee bank, and it would say Indianapolis is going to get the money. It's going to get deposited with the trustee bank into a construction fund, and that trustee can only disperse monies from that account for properly approved claims that are part of the project as described in the indenture. And that's how we ensure that money is safeguarded. And then Brenda, you want to talk a little bit maybe about like what the trustee does with debt payments and paying bondholders and like the reserve fund, how that works?
Sure. So they also will establish like a debt service reserve fund for certain types of bonds. And that's in place where to essentially make sure that the bond payments, the principal and interest payments get paid. And if there were ever to be a shortfall, then they have this debt service reserve fund in place in order to take that money and to ensure that the bond will not go into default.
Yeah, and they'll send claims. So, with cities and towns, they'll have a clerk treasurer or a controller, or a school corporation is going to have a business manager or a treasurer. We call these the fiscal officers. A controller, sometimes it's referred to in a second class city or first class city. The trustee will send an invoice to those fiscal officers each time a bond payment is due and invoice them, and then they're to get payment back. And then they'll take those monies and they will pay them out to the bondholders. They call it a register of who the registered bondholders are. And so they're really a critical role in this bond process of making sure bondholders are getting paid, the money's getting collected, and the project funds being properly applied. And so they'll be in that role for the life of the bond issue, which
25 years,
yeah,
30
up
years.
to 25 years, most of them 20 years. And they're kind of the safekeeper of the funds. And it's a role that takes place once the bonds are issued. I kind of view our role as sort of, we do all this work up to when the bonds are issued, and then we typically step back.
And the trustee takes over.
Yeah, the trustee takes over, and there's some post-issuance activities that take place, but it's kind of a neat process. There are some times when bonds are sold just directly to one bank or one bondholder. In that case, there may not be a trustee involved simply because that bank is going to be overseeing the bond issue itself because they're the sole bondholder. But in most cases, we'll have a trustee involved. And would you say there's like 3 or 4 big banks in Indianapolis that do this work? It's not really common. It's not like there's banks all over Indiana that do this. There's some just key banks involved with it.
Yep. So they're oftentimes a member of the working group, And then another key member would be the local attorney or the local counsel who's representing the unit of government or the school board. And we'll work with them to make sure that the meetings are set, that they have a quorum at their meeting. They help us make sure that the requirements for having a properly held meeting are established. And then also some of our local councils feel comfortable presenting the bond ordinance and explaining the issuance process to the council at these council meetings where they'll go through the adoption process for the bond ordinance. And other local attorneys want us to be there to explain the bond issuance process. So we just work with them and determine what their comfort level is with issuing bonds, and they help us navigate anything at the local level with getting information.
I was going to say like nuances. Like
Yes.
you said it earlier, personalities, elected officials. It can be difficult sometimes getting a project approved. It may be that there's a handful of elected officials that want a project to take place, but maybe there's some members on a council or other elected officials that aren't so hot on a project. A lot of times when we're talking with the local councils, we can kind of get the lay of the land, so to speak, of who's in support of a project, who's not, maybe some just unique events that have transpired around the project, things that we wouldn't know. And also sometimes every once in a while we'll come across a municipality that will have a local rule about how they handle getting an ordinance adopted. It could be like, well, hey,
3 readings.
Yeah, 3 readings. We require this to be filed 3 weeks in advance with the clerk. And oh, we're going to have these sort of committee meetings before we go to the council.
Yes.
Nothing we would know by statute, and things are getting better with the internet. But I remember before we really had many municipal websites, it was really hard to know that type of process. And
sometimes that's still not posted on the website. So we rely on the local council to fill us in and to help us make the process even smoother with information that only the local attorney would know, or the people who live there would know, but we would not know coming into this process. And the local council will also sign an opinion as part of most of these bond issuances. So that would be included in that big transcript that Dennis held up earlier. And they would certify, like, for example, one thing that comes to mind is we've done a lot of sewer and water projects lately, which would involve like putting lines in the ground. And they would go through and make sure that all of the easements have been acquired if necessary. And they do a lot of like the local, even like real estate work that might be required as part of this project. So they would certify in their opinion that has been done and the land rights are there. Something that we don't certify to as bond counsel, but the local attorney would take care of those certifications.
And like that, seems like no pending or threatened litigation. And then also compliance with open door law requirements is a big thing that they cover. One of the things with government entities talking about public funds is there are open door law requirements. So these meetings have to comply with open door law requirements, very much like the bond bank does. They comply with open door law requirements, which means posting notice of the meeting. And if you have hearings, advertising them in a proper amount of time. And we typically will make sure that the hearing notices are done, but the open door posting type things are covered by local counsel. And it's been interesting. I feel like we're sort of coming out of the COVID age here in terms of some of the restrictions and lockdowns that occurred. But during the period of COVID was very interesting to see how that was handled at the local government level. Things I would have never predicted would happen, but we had the governor's emergency orders that were being renewed. I can't remember if it was every 30 days or 60 days, but basically saying, hey, during this 30-day window, governmental entities can meet virtually. And there was a modification to the open door law requirements. So it's these unique things that are happening, and we're sort of corresponding with local counsel all the time to make sure that things are on the agenda, notices have been posted. A lot of times, if I have a public hearing I'm going to, sometimes like the rate hearings, we all have stories about them, but you can get a heads up from the local council, like, hey, are we expecting a crowd?
Is it contentious?
Is it contentious? How big is it going to be? What kinds of questions or concerns should we expect from the crowd, just so we can kind of be prepared as we go into it. I know we have some stories over the years, and sometimes Brenda said this, the local council may want us to be there. Sometimes it's just to take, let's say, lack of a better word, but kind of
blame.
take the heat off of them and the local officials, you know. I had an attorney one time tell me, well, put your rain jacket on. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? He goes, just be prepared for it to rain on you while you're in that meeting. And don't worry about it. Take it off when you get out. It's not personal. And I've always found at those meetings, for the most part, people understand when they hear the facts and circumstances about a rate increase. But they do want to voice their opinions to the council to let them know. And so that's typically what happens at those things.
Do you want to take a pause and see if anybody has questions about the working group members or the roles that any of those players have?
Oh, are the funds generated from the government entity or investors? What's the average life of a bond?
That's it. Okay, that goes to the a revenue
Yeah.
question. Let's talk about revenues.
Okay.
So I'll start with essentially like a revenue bond. A lot of times would be like a water bond or a sewer project, and those would be issued by the local unit of government, a city or the town, essentially for an infrastructure project. And that bond would be paid back by user fees. So that's what we talk about with a rate increase. Like if your water bill goes up, part of your water bill payment may be utilized to pay back the debt service, the principal and interest on these bonds that are issued for a new water tower or a new water line. So those revenues are generated by the public who are using the service, using the infrastructure, and they're used by the town. Those revenues are collected by the town and then used to pay back the debt service on that type of a bond.
Yep. And it's pretty interesting. You talk about the working group members. This is where a municipal advisor is really important. We call these sort of enterprise funds, but the theory is a sewer project's paid with sewer revenues. My sewer bill, I flushed the toilet, I'm paying for that. And that money is going to the government, and the government's using that to pay operating and maintenance expenses and debt service on bonds. Same thing with water. The water rates pay for water project.
Stormwater.
Stormwater. Electric. There's kind of a general theory in law, especially if you're over at the utility commission, you don't cross subsidize utilities in Indiana. They're siloed. So a sewer customer ought not be paying for water infrastructure. And, when you do your electric bill, you ought not be paying for sewer because you use electric doesn't necessarily mean you're using sewer. But when a project's being financed or undertaken, one of the first steps in it is, well, what's the estimated cost? And under my existing revenues from my utility, can I afford to pay for that? Can the town pay for that $3 million project?
With that pot of revenues.
And that all goes into how many customers do you have? What's the volume of usage? When was the last time you did a rate increase? And Brenda, what's the general standard market coverage ratio here?
1.25.
1.25. And what's that mean?
So basically they want to make sure that they have enough revenues to cover 125% of that principal and interest, the debt service payments on those bonds.
After paying for expenses.
After paying expenses.
That comes first.
To prevent likelihood of, they don't want to go into default or not have enough money to pay back these bonds over the 15, 20, 25 years that they're issued.
Yeah. So that's part of the process of looking at all of these things and seeing whether or not the project's feasible. There's a certain level of rate increase that people may or may not be willing to accept. And it really depends on what the community is and how badly they need the project.
Well, what their project is.
Yeah.
Sure. Sometimes we'll help them establish like a phased in rate increase where they'll do a phase 1, 6 or 8 months later, step it up again to a phase 2. So then it's not such a hard hit with the initial rate increase.
Yeah.
So all of that just goes back to like the timing of the project, when the bonds will be issued, the amount. Really, like the municipal advisor helps establish like the inputs and the schedules.
Yeah, and other sources of payment. So we kind of cover those enterprise funds, we call them, the utility funds, but the others can be property tax levies. So most of the school bonds that are out there, for example, are paid from a property tax levy. We call it a debt service levy. the other kinds of projects, I'm thinking of like traditional city hall, police station, town hall bonds, general obligation bonds or property tax levies. There's also tax increment financing, TIF. You want to talk about that a little bit, Brenda?
Sure. Tax increment financing essentially is the assessment, like the assessed value of a parcel of property. So what they'll do is they'll go through and they'll establish what the base level is from a property tax standpoint for this area of land. And then we'll create a TIF district, including specific parcels. And then any development that occurs in the future on those specific parcels will oftentimes increase the assessed value of those parcels. So it's the difference between the base assessed value and the incremental assessed value. That difference is deposited, those revenues, it's property tax revenues, those are deposited into an increment fund, a tax increment fund. And then that increment can be used to pay for development. Like if there's a developer that comes in and puts a hotel on a specific parcel of property, like the increment can be used to pay back the developer for their investment. Or the project that I'm working up on in Northern Indiana, it will be used, the incremental assessed value or the increment generated by the developer's investment in that residential subdivision will be used to pay that developer back over time for their investment in the infrastructure that they've paid for in that specific residential subdivision.
Good.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I say a good example, and I'm looking out the window here at the field house now, and right across the street is a new hotel. It's a Hyatt Place hotel. I don't know if any of you've been over there. They have a real cool bar, like on the second floor. That it looks out right next to the arena. It's a really neat place. We worked on that project a few years ago. It was about an $80 or $90 million hotel project, but as part of that project, that land was not getting developed very well because there was a perpetual easement on the property where an adjoining landowner said, well, forever on this ground, there's going to be parking for these certain buildings. And so the city of Indianapolis agreed with that hotel developer to say, we'll use tax increment financing to support the development of a large parking garage for that hotel that will provide the necessary parking to satisfy that perpetual easement and parking for the hotel. And then hotel developer, you're going to go ahead and you're going to invest $80 or $90 million and build this fabulous hotel, which they did. Early on in the process, we worked with the municipal advisor to say, all right, assuming $80 or $90 million of investment, here's how much tax increment that will generate over the life of the bond issue. We'll then back that into a TIF bond to determine how big the TIF bond could be. Now, that isn't actually the amount of TIF bond that was issued. It was much less than that because the city of Indianapolis, when they do their projects, they don't give all the TIF bond money away. They know they need it for other projects or to pass through to other taxing units. But they were able to sort of bridge the gap and say, well, we'll contribute, I believe in that case, it was $17 million to help build that parking garage. And it's a perfect example of redevelopment and how the TIF process works. And what will be really nice is when those bonds finally pay off, the TIF area will go away. That increase in assessed value will now benefit all of the taxing districts. The hotel is going to be there for a long time, and it helps support the field house and other things going on.
Incentivizes developers as a way to invest in these communities, but then they can also capture their investment over a period of the life of the bonds.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a neat example because that parcel of property was just sort of sitting there with not much going on. And if you drove by it, you'd say, well, I can't believe that's not been developed. Why hasn't that been developed? And you wouldn't know that, well, there was this perpetual easement on there to provide parking. And that was always the difficulty in getting something established there because it was expensive to put a parking garage in there. So TIF, the other neat source of income that's really becoming more and more, I think, part of our practice, and we're all probably paying for it somewhere where we live, is local income taxes. Most counties now have adopted some form of local income tax. So this is a tax on your income that they collect, and then it gets allocated to the various taxing units. So cities, towns, in some cases townships, and they can use the income tax monies to do various projects. And Brenda, I'm thinking like the categories are what? Public safety, economic development, and then they call them certified shares, which we can use for just about anything. But that is more and more becoming a kind of a source of income. Brendan and I just finished a project a couple months ago on a new jail facility in a county in northeast Indiana, using what they call the public safety income tax. It's the income tax that's collected, and it means it can be used for public safety purposes only. So that's police protection, fire protection, correctional facilities.
Is that the only form of revenue that they were using, or do they mix?
We mix, you're right. We mix it. We had a correctional facility lit too, lit meaning local income tax that was in the mix. And then we had a property tax backup behind that bond issue as well. So
oftentimes we'll see, like with TIF bonds, they'll have a property tax backup to make the bonds more marketable and more stable when they go to sell the bonds or place the bonds, just because sometimes certain revenue streams are considered more volatile or uncertain.
yeah,
So then they'll have a property tax backup pledge in order to help stabilize the bonds, like when they go to sell it, and then they'll get a better interest rate.
yeah, we kind of talk about like who's buying these bonds. And it's kind of all over the place, really. It just depends on the kind of bond. And there's some real traditional markets, and then there's some kind of untraditional markets. And, you know, I suppose it's probably like when you go borrow money for a house or a car loan, you know, there's probably any number of places you can look to borrow money from, and they're going to have advantages and disadvantages for each of them. It might be maybe you pay a higher interest rate, but you have more flexibility with your credit history or your terms. Or maybe you pay a lower interest rate, but you have to have a larger down payment, or you've got to post more collateral. It's kind of the same thing with the bond market on a high level. There are certain programs we work with all the time on water and sewer projects. One of them is rural development. It's kind of neat. They have a 40-year term and below market interest rates. But Brenda, there's limitations, aren't there, on the size of the community?
There are,
Small issuers.
yeah, and they have to qualify. Rural development has, different requirements.
Yeah.
A lot of times it is really small communities. And like Dinah said, it's for 40 years. And if you think 40 years, that's a long time to take out a bond and essentially obligate this community for like the next 40 years to have this debt out there. A lot of times it's for infrastructure, water and sewer. Another program we work with a lot is the Indiana Finance Authority State Revolving Fund, and they do a lot of water and sewer projects around the state. We work with them frequently, many closings a year, and they have requirements too. One of their missions is to help these smaller communities have the opportunity to issue these bonds at a low interest rate that they wouldn't be able to get if they were just trying to issue $1 million like independently. And they can go to the SRF program and usually get around a 2% interest rate that resets every quarter. But it's typically been around 2%.
Yeah, we work with the Indiana Bond Bank's another one as well.
Yep.
We have a number of water and sewer clients that are nonprofit entities. And one of the neat things about the Indiana Bond Bank is it can act as what they call a conduit issuer, meaning the bond bank can issue the debt on behalf of the nonprofit entity. And through that process, that nonprofit entity can get the benefit of tax exemption. So we've had a number of nonprofits, we've done that over the years, and we have to get what's called volume cap. And other deals we've done through the bond bank, we've been able to pool issuers. So this is kind of a neat feature, and the bond bank is the only one that can do it, where if we have a number of, let's say, school corporations that are issuing pension bonds, they're all issuing the same kind of debt at about the same time. They can be pooled together and done as one large issue through the bond bank. And through that economy of scales, they can get the benefit of a lower interest rate, reduced cost of issuance. And so we always look to the bond bank, SRF program, RD, and then there's the traditional sources, which are working with underwriting firms. So I say underwriting firms, it's Raymond James,
Baird.
Baird, Stifel Nicholas, KeyBank, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, any number of these underwriting firms, they actually go buy the bonds and then they immediately resell them to a pool of investors they have. That's a traditional underwriting. And also, I would say probably since 2008, we've seen a lot of activity with direct bank purchases. So there are a lot of banks in Indianapolis and actually throughout the state of Indiana who have an interest in buying the bonds and holding them to maturity. And they sometimes will have size limitations, depending on the size of the bank, or term limits, like they may not want to go out more than 10 years.
Yeah. And sometimes I've found, like with some of our smaller issuers, they'll have a bank, a local bank that's really interested in making that investment into the community. So then they'll want to be considered as a purchaser for those bonds. A lot of times we can just, put together a term sheet and like negotiate that with them, help the community negotiate that with the bank.
Yeah, that's kind of neat. I like to see that involvement too at the local level. And sometimes I get the question from, I might be at a school board meeting and the school board's issuing 20 million of bonds, and there's someone in the audience goes, well, hey, I'd like to buy some of those bonds. I want to help out. And most of those deals, there's an underwriter involved, but we can get them in contact with the underwriter so that the underwriter can include them in the offering. So they actually can invest in those.
Sure.
And then let's talk a little bit about developer purchase TIF bonds. We're seeing a lot of these now.
Mhm.
There's a lot of developers out there that are putting up, Indiana's kind of the crossroads of America. You have access to what, 2/3 of the United States? What is it,
Like
within 24 hours or something?
Less than that.
Yeah, so all these distribution facilities around central Indiana, the big box warehouses they call, a lot of developers have built these. A lot of them are in TIF areas. They have big property tax bills. They're just sort of ripe for a TIF project because a lot of them have infrastructure that needs to be built around them. So oftentimes a developer will go, hey, I will build this big box warehouse. I'm going to create jobs and we need to do a TIF bond. And if the community is willing to, they'll probably say, well, we'll do a TIF bond, but developer, we're not going to put any backing behind it. We'll pledge 80% of TIF, but you're going to have to buy the bond. And like Brenda was saying, community is not going to put a backing on most of those deals because they don't want the risk. So in that case, the developers will actually purchase those bonds. And if everything goes well, they'll probably be able to resell them in 3 or 4 years when
Sure.
their construction risk is done. That's kind of the world of investors, aren't they?
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, there's others out there from time to time. We're starting to see people buying, I call them naked TIF bonds, which is kind of interesting, where it used to be just developers were buying their own bonds, but there's some investors out there now who are willing to take that risk and buy those bonds, which I see that as kind of a pre-2008 collapse thing that was going on before 2008 and the market tanked and some of those people got stuck. But
I'm starting to come back.
yeah, it's all part of it. It's just like you go buy a car and you borrow money and you go buy a house, they're going to look at your credit history and that all plays into what interest rates you're going to pay.
Let's pause and see if there's any other questions. Was there a second part of that question that was listed earlier? It kind of disappeared down here.
Yeah.
Okay, what is the average life of a bond? Well, it depends on what type of bond, what the project is. So there's a concept when you issue bonds, like you want to make sure that the debt doesn't exceed the life of the project or the infrastructure that's being financed. So that's where the engineer comes in and they'll say this water tank is going to be good for 40 years. So if your bond issue only goes out for 20 or 25 years, it's fine. Or this road is going to be good for 10 years. And there's all these calculations that the engineer will do to help us they'll calculate that with the financial advisor, the weighted average maturity, which goes to like the average life of all of the assets or the infrastructure that are being bond financed. So that helps also determine, like, can we have only a 10-year maturity on these bonds, or can we go out 20 years? Or with rural development, they go out for 40 years. So they'll want to make sure that those assets or the infrastructure that they're issuing the debt for will last for a minimum of 40 years.
And it ties into, I think you hit upon this, the tax exemption on the bonds. There's state law requirements on it. You don't want to issue bonds for longer than the life of the asset generally, but there are federal tax rules that say you can't bond finance a project for a certain period beyond the economic life.
Yep.
And one of the big things that we do, and if we've not mentioned it before, most of the bonds we're issuing are tax exempt for federal tax law purposes. What does that mean? That means that if you own the bond and you're getting your interest payment, you don't include that on your tax income. You don't pay income tax on that. In the real market, that probably saves you 100 to 150 basis points. That's 1 to 1.5% borrowing cost for the issuer. Because the holder of the bond's not paying taxes on that, you get a lower borrowing rate. So we're always trying to structure bonds as tax exempt. We can't always do it. And sometimes we don't want to tie ourselves in doing that. But on all of them, one of the key things is like Brenda mentioned, this economic life, and that goes into how long the bond can be.
Are there other questions?
What does this say here?
Hold on.
Go ahead.
DeAndre.
So could you two, if possible, speak to more about how a nonprofit could partake in bonds and development? I'm here in Evansville, Indiana, and I just formed my first nonprofit, and we're working on a commercial property. And that's one of our core objectives, is to purchase commercial properties and then develop them for-profit businesses, particularly in the entrepreneurial space. And so I'm just trying to learn about how Impact Evansville, which is the name of the nonprofit, can just take advantage of all the tools, resources, collaborations, connections, et cetera, to help get a lot of these projects done for the future. So if you could help speak to more of nonprofit work.
Yeah, DeAndre, first off, thanks. That sounds like a great organization that you're involved with. I think that's awesome for the Evansville area. Certainly all areas can do that. Is your nonprofit, is it a 501c3 organization, do you know?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. So nonprofit 501c3 organizations can issue debt on a tax exempt basis for federal tax law purposes. We call that a conduit issuer. And the best examples that we can give out there are a lot of the hospital financings are done on a conduit basis. Charter school financings, which we've done a number of, are done as a conduit basis. YMCAs, other charitable organizations will do tax exempt financing. There's some tax rules involved with it. First off, you've got to be a 501c3 organization. The proceeds of the bonds have to be used in furtherance of your governmental purpose. So, DeAndre, if you were to go borrow money, your organization, through a bond issue, you'd have a certification. Part of what we do is prepare a document that would say, yeah, you're going to use them to help benefit these other entities in furtherance of your purpose. But the key thing is understanding on these. What we can do is get you the benefit, I shouldn't say we, but what can be done is you can get the benefit of tax exemption if you have a bankable loan. So if you are able to go out with your organization and borrow money from a bank, and I'll just say hypothetically here, let's say you'd been talking to a bank and they said, yes, we'll loan your organization $4 million to do this project over a 20-year period. And they're giving you a taxable rate. They're saying, and we're going to give you that at a 6% fixed interest rate, for example. What we could do is we could say, well, let's turn that into a federally tax exempt rate by running it through a conduit issuer, such as, and off the top of my head, like an Indiana bond bank, if it was a qualified entity under their statute, but it could also be the city of Evansville could act as the issuer. And the other organization that does this a lot is the Indiana Finance Authority. And so if you have a bankable loan and you're a 501c3, you can turn it into a tax exempt loan. So that would lower your interest rate. And that would then take some of the burden of that debt service off your organization. And then you could use that added money, help you to kind of further your purposes. Does that answer your question, DeAndre?
Yes, that was great. I appreciate that. I'm also going to add you two on LinkedIn so that we can stay in touch, because I may have further questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, we do a fair amount of work with the Indiana Housing Community and Development Authority. Now, those entities are not 501c3, but the space you're talking about in our world, we kind of call it the private activity space.
Yeah.
And it's a different, Brenda and I do a lot of traditional financings, and then I probably do more of the private activity stuff. Jacob McClellan down the hallway here is our private activity guy, I would call him. But 501c3 organizations, we kind of solid waste facilities. So if you are a company that has a big solid waste disposal facility, you can get tax exempt financing for it. Certain water and sewer facilities of private companies can be done on a tax exempt basis. Airports, there's kind of a laundry list of these things and different rules, but the one thing you got to remember, they all have to go through a governmental entity to issue the bonds. City of Indianapolis does a lot of these for housing. Indiana Housing Authority does a lot of them. And they're not obligated on the bonds, their name's on them, but there's a loan agreement that basically says, like DeAndre, in your case, there'd be a loan agreement that would say, Evansville issued them, but it's DeAndre's organization who's obligated on the bonds solely and exclusively. But yeah, you get that tax exemption. It's a really good way to save yourself money on the financing process.
Thank you. Thank you both for educating me on that. I got some more homework to do.
Are there any other questions? Because it looks like we only have a few more minutes left.
Well, I'd just like to say thanks, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed the session. I think it's been fun. We've enjoyed it. Brenda and I were kind of talking beforehand, like, are we going to have enough to talk about? And I said, well, I think we could probably talk forever. But hopefully we've kept all of your attention. And I'd just like to say, if there are those in the audience that ever do have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us. Our law firm's on the website, and Mark's got our contact information at the bond bank as well. And we're always interested to talk about finance and hopefully help people with good projects like DeAndre mentioned.
Yeah, thank you again for all of your input and your time today.
Thank you, Brendan, Dennis. I speak for everybody. Thank you. And we will see you tomorrow. Great topic that piggybacks off this. Tomorrow, dive even a little bit into a specific sector with our friends from KeyBank. We'll talk about American infrastructure, and it's a huge topic nowadays. And so I think it's perfectly teed up with this overview today. And then we'll move into infrastructure tomorrow for our final one before Friday's Lunch and Learn is really that solution science fair where we get to see innovators kind of show off and tell us what they created over the Flipping Finance Challenge before Saturday's closing ceremony. So it's good to see everybody. Take care, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.
Hey, Mark, did DeAndre put his email address in the chat?